Okay, let's take a look at Marie Lugones' text, Purity, Impurity, and Separation. This is a difficult text. She purposefully weaves in both Spanish and English. Let's see if we can get a handle on some of the main claims that Lugones is making here. Her overall thesis in this text would be the claim that Mestizaje ways of being are sites of resistance to logics of purity, those logics that control, dominate, and maintain interlocking systems of oppression by training and socializing subjects into fictional subject positions. And these fictional subject positions confer a sense of dominance and a sense of purity, disembodiment, rationality. And we'll take a look at each of these things in turn. So, let's start with Mestizaje. Mestizaje is a metaphor for impurity. This comes out of the cultural mixing or blending in South and Central America. And so Mestizaje is a metaphor for impurity, literally, ontological impurity, and it's also a metaphor for resistance, resisting pure logics. So it invokes both logics of purity and logics of impurity. Logics of purity are attempts to control and dominate people with a kind of categorical eye. What we've seen in some of the readings already as dominance, arrogant perception, biologic. So logics of purity want to separate everything into pure elements for the purpose of control. To separate is to fragment, rather than to separate. And we'll talk more about these two distinct forms of separation as well. So Mestizaje is a way of being that challenges the kind of control sought by logics of purity. So if we take the pure subject at his word, that he is a pure, rational subject, this is a historical subject who has put himself in the subject position as opposed to those he others. So think back to Beauvoir's essay on self and other. This pure subject takes himself to be pure, rational, disembodied, yet he is at the same time impure and multiplicitous. But if we take the pure subject at his word, that he is a disembodied, purely rational subject, then all we can see is the successful oppression of others, which is to see through the eyes of the lover of purity. So Lugones is giving us an account here which asks us to take on multiple perspectives simultaneously, to see the lover of purity through his own eyes, and to see the lover of purity through the resistant eyes of the Mestizaje, the curdle-separated, the multiplicitous, the cultured. Although they claim to have a pure subject position, the split-separated, the lovers of purity, are also and simultaneously curdle-separated. So they're simultaneously pure and fragmented on the one hand, and impure and multiple on the other hand. And this distinction between the pure and fragmented on the one hand and the impure and multiple on the other hand can be understood as applying to both individuals and societies and communities. And in the world of the lover of purity, control, fictions of purity, unity, and categorization work together as a network of forces to produce this fiction of the pure, disembodied, rational subject. If we look at the logic of purity through a Mestizaje lens, we can see the logic of curdling. So we can see that the social world is complex and heterogeneous, not simple and homogeneous. And we can see that persons are multiple, they're not fragmented, but rather curdled, multiple subjects, and they're embodied. So to be fragmented is to be in pieces, parts that don't fit well. But the pieces themselves are separate and pure. There are parts that are fragmented from the other parts that are taken as wholes, like rationality. And from the perspective of the logic of purity, the world is unified and fragmented, homogeneous, and hierarchically ordered, persons are either fragmented and composite or abstract and unified. So from the logic of purity, any kind of separation is a fragmentation, is a split separation in the form of fragmentation, where unified parts split off from one another. So the object or the other is seen as fragmented, as seen as having fragmented parts, whereas the subject, the man of reason, is seen as being abstract and unified, one whole unified being. So unification requires a fragmented and hierarchical ordering, but it's more than an interpretation of the world as such. It's more than an ontology, because it actually orders people's lives and psyches through what Lugones calls a process of domination in which power and ideology are at all times changing into each other. So it's an inculcation, it's a teaching of ways of being through domination. So power and ideology are constantly changing into each other in this process of unification and purification. The urge to control the multiplicity of people and things is expressed philosophically through abstraction and categorization from the vantage point of a lover of purity. So there's a particular attitude driving the logic of purity here. And this domination occurs through a complex series of fictions. Once there is some assumption of unity, that is, an act of fragmentation that separates into whole parts, underlying multiplicity, further fictions rationalize it as a discovery. So think about the texts we've read on gender, race, sexuality, and able-bodiedness this term. In what ways does dominant society assume a kind of unity through arrogant perception, through logics of purity, through biologic? In what ways do we, as members of a dominant society, perceive others as unified wholes based on one aspect of a person's visual identity? So there's an assumption of unity that generates the fictional construction of a vantage point from which unified wholes and totalities can be captured. Yet the vantage point and the subject are actually outside of historicity and outside of concrete reality. In fact, the vantage point is a privileged, simple, one-dimensional vantage point where the subject is taken to be fragmented or abstract and without particularity. So let's take a look at a spreadsheet that might help to flesh some of this out. And I'll post this online. So let's take a look at this. Lugones is comparing logics of purity to logics of impurity here, right? And she's saying that logics of purity operate on a kind of split separation that fragments people and societies or cultures into distinct pure parts. And the parts are unified. And this subject position is kind of an abstract subposition. It's homogeneous, that is, the pure rational subject is always the same, without any particularities of the lived world. And this subject position is a subject position that employs the logic of purity in order to control others. Whereas the logic of impurity is a way of understanding people and societies and cultures as multiple, as always already multiple, more than pure parts. And so the separation of people or cultures into parts is never a split separation, but always a curdle separation, a curdling. She gives the example of the mayonnaise, right? You can never quite mix the egg and the oil all the way, right? You can never quite separate the egg and the egg yolk. You can never quite mix the oil and water all the way. There's always a kind of curdle separation where persons and cultures are always multiple and not pure fragmented parts or unified. So there's always a disunity on the logic of impurity. People are always embodied, not disembodied. Never abstract, always heterogeneous, not homogeneous. So never the same. They're fluid, dynamic, and multiple. And moreover, the attitude or the motivation behind logics of impurity is creativity, whereas the motivation or attitude behind logics of purity is control or domination. The subjects produced by logics of purity see themselves as unified subjects, though this is a fictional subject position. Because remember, there's no such thing, actually, as a unified, disembodied, pure subject. We are always particular. We're always embodied, never abstract, never completely unified. So this subject position, the subject position of the unified subject, or the man of reason, is a subject position that is outside of history and culture. So for these subjects, you can think of Descartes and his meditations, things like emotion and sensuality, or even the concrete everyday tasks of life, are always taken care of by others, usually women. And so these subjects can continue the fiction to see themselves as unified, abstract persons of reason, not persons of emotion, right? To see themselves as pure subjects. But, as Lugones is going to point out, since control precedes and in fact causes this fictional vantage point, it cannot be rationally justified. So there's a paradox here. The unified subject sees himself as pure and abstract and purely rational. Yet this subject position is actually caused by emotions, that is, the urge to control and dominate. So the fictional subject position of pure, rational, unified subjectivity cannot exist because this subject position is caused by emotion and irrational urges to control and dominate others. So it's a paradox, and Lugones points out how it is that this subject position must be fictional. In fact, this unified subject displays a lack of agency. Because the unified subject is outside of history and culture, outside of any particular or concrete lived world, he has no inscriptions on the body, no particularities. He is actually self-deceived and claims to disown his own urges and needs. And this would be a giving up of agency. By refusing to own his own emotions, his own needs, his own urges and desires, the unified subject would actually be giving up the kind of agency he might have in his lived experience. But in fact, we know that this is not actually the case. So this unified subject position is completely a fiction, though it's a real fiction. It's a real fiction that some people are seen as ideal subjects. And this fiction is perpetuated through this logic of purity, which becomes a way of training other people. So we've talked a little bit about normalization of bodies, especially with respect to Fausto Sterling's piece and all the way down to Ogiyemi's piece on biologic. Subjects are constructed within particular frameworks, within particular societies, within particular ideologies. And this logic of purity is a logic or a framework through which subjects are constructed. We're told to use biologic as a way of perceiving others. We're taught to arrogantly perceive. We're taught to compare ourselves to ideal bodies, to ideal ways of being. And this construction of subjectivity has a kind of process to it. It involves the constant categorization of others through arrogant perception. And in this process, ambiguity is completely non-existent. So through a logic of purity, ambiguity is non-existent because everything and everyone is categorizable, is splittable, is definable, and is reducible. So there's an attitude or a motivation or an urge to control and dominance at play in logics of purity. And this is a logic that we all take part in to greater and lesser degrees. What Lugones is arguing is that in actuality, we all exist as disunified subjects. We come into the world always already as multiple subjects, never as fragmented beings with clean, unified parts. We're never merely rational or merely irrational. We're always already both rational and irrational beings. We're always already multiple beings. We're always already ambiguous, cultured, resistant subjects. We're always already poor, colored, queer, disabled. Yet our multiplicity gets put into this logic of purity as a training, as an inculcation, as a process of split separation, as a process of categorization, as a process of identity formation. Because ambiguous subjects threaten logics of purity, which is a fiction. So Lugones is saying that we're all multiple subjects, but we can either buy into logics of purity and participate in the control and dominance and policing and normalization of bodies and others, or we can embrace our multiplicity and resist logics of purity. So these logics of purity then are an urge to control the multiplicity of people and things, and this urge is expressed philosophically through a kind of abstraction and categorization of bodies from the vantage point of a lover of purity. Why else would we categorize people based on body types, if not for reasons of control and dominance? This domination, this control that Lugones is talking about, occurs through a complex series of fictions. So these fictions of the logic of purity rationalize themselves as discoveries, like the discovery that there are two genders or two sexes, or the discovery of race, or the discovery of able-bodiedness. These discoveries are nothing more than categorizations that are repeatedly employed as a means of dominating and controlling others. So the assumption of unity generates the fictional construction of a vantage point from which unified wholes and totalities and pure subjects can be captured, yet the vantage point and the subject itself are outside of historicity and concreteness. So the vantage point is privileged, yet the subject is one-dimensional and fragmented and abstract, but without particularity. The series of fictions at play in the logics of purity, in the ideologies, in the categorizations, in the ideals, the normalizations, and the policing of logics of purity, actually hides the training itself, hides the inculcation. Recall all the way back to Bartke's piece, mystification. Often the means of oppression, and in this case the means of control and dominance, are mystified by the very production or perpetuation of oppression and dominance. So the training of the multiple into the unified actually mystifies or hides the fact that those trainings are based on fictions. So it's only from a historical meshing in the concrete that a multiplicitous subject can be trained to see with a different logic. Because the logic of purity hides the construction of unity. Unity is a construction, it's not a reality. In reality, we're all particular and multiple and ambiguous beings. So the conception of the vantage point of purity follows the urge to control. It doesn't precede it, it follows it. It's caused by it. And so the vantage point is as ideal as the ideal subject, as the pure subject, as the pure man of reason. Reason is seen as this ability to abstract, to categorize, and to train the multiple, the cultured, the abnormal, to the systematicity of norms and rules, which is what characterizes the subject as a unity. So a multiplicitous subject perceives the world as multiple, sensuously, passionately, as well as rationally, without split separating between emotion, reason, and sense. The multiplicitous subject lacks the unidimensionality and simplicity required of the privileged vantage point, the vantage point of reason, where all of the subject's abilities cannot be exercised. In fact, as we said, because all of the subject's abilities cannot be exercised, his agency in terms of emotion, the vantage point itself becomes invalidated, becomes seen as purely fictional. The modern subject is masked, separate from his own multiplicity, to appear able to reduce heterogeneity to homogeneity and multiplicity to unity. And his purification requires that he understand himself as someone who justifiably exercises control over multiplicity, makes sense of the world, puts people into the appropriate categories. In the meantime, his human particular needs, his sensuality, his affectivity, his embodiment, must be taken care of by others hidden outside of public view, where he parades himself as pure and post-cultural. So the modern subject is a fiction of his own imagination, but his imagination is mediated by the labor of others. He controls those who produce him as impartial reasoner, since to his eyes, those enmeshed in multiplicity, those lacking unity, the queer, the disabled, the colored, the homosexual, are unable to occupy the vantage point of pure subject, and so they require his control. So this lack of pure rationality is symbolically produced, marking the producers of purity as gendered, racialized, and cultured. So to be marked is to be tainted by need, to be tainted by emotion, the body, relative to the modern subject's urge to control through the maintenance of his privileged unified subject position. But to the extent that he is fictional, that he occupies a fictional subject position of pure reason, the tainting itself is fictional. So seeing others as tainted, as inferior, as non-ideal, depends on a logic of and need for purity. So being non-dichotomous, ambiguous, multiplicitous, threatens the fiction and training of the logic of purity. So lovers of purity are threatened by multiplicity. The modern subject disowns his own urges and needs, even while he covets, possesses, destroys, and pleases himself. He is rescued from his own incoherence by self-deception, by weakness of the will, and by aggressive ignorance. So once the lover of purity ignores the unfounded presupposition of unity, all further ignoring and shunning of impurity, ambiguity, and multiplicity becomes easier. So the lover of purity remains ignorant of his own impurity, participating in what Lugones calls pollution behavior, which guards the privileged subject position by controlling pollution, that which is impure, that which is anomalous, that which is ambiguous, that which is out of place, that which is undefinable, that which threatens order. So the lover of purity maintains a logic of purity, implements a logic of purity in order to control others. The Mestizaje subject position, on the other hand, is an example of a split self that is not split fragmented, but is curdled. So she discusses the Mexican American as having a dual personality, the Chicano as mestizo. And Lugones talks about how the Mexican American is a product of the Anglo imagination, having both an authentic Mexican self and an American self. So the Mexican American is split, fragmented by lovers of purity in order to control the very identity of the Mexican American. So these cells, from the vantage point of the lover of purity, are conceptually distinct, complementary, yet contradictory. And so there's this notion that Mexican Americans ought to assimilate so as to be exploitable, yet keep their culture so as to be different, inferior, marked, other. And this assimilation can happen because the Mexicanness of Mexican American is thought to be ornamental. The authentic Mexican makes Mexican arts and crafts and is portrayed as violent, hardworking, drunken, and poor. And so retaining these fragmented parts allows for control through logics of purity. So the dual personality is a death-loving attempt to eradicate the possibility of a mestiza consciousness, to eradicate multiplicity, to eradicate the inability to be controlled. We talked about fragmentation at the beginning of the term with Bartke's piece on psychological oppression, and Lugones talks about fragmentation of the subject as a consequence of group oppression, following the logic of purity. She argues, I think we need a solution to the problem of walking from one of one's groups to another, being mistreated, misunderstood, engaging in self-abuse and self-betrayal for the sake of the group that only distorts our needs because they erase our complexity. So, fragmentation is conceptually at odds with seeing oppression as interlocked. To fragment persons into unified parts, rather than seeing them as curdled beings, as multiple beings, is to refuse to see interlocking oppressions. So, individuals are transparent to their group if the group perceives their needs and interests as those of the group, and if this perception becomes dominant in the group. So recall with Spellman and Crenshaw, we begin to see an issue with intra-group difference, that is, with multiplicity within the group or within the person. And intersectionality is a method used to identify intra-group differences among women of color. And similarly, Lugones is arguing that individuals who are othered from within their own group, who are marginalized within their own groups, because their needs and interests are different or unique, become thickly transparent. That is, transparent group members become unaware of their transparency and of their difference from other members of the group. So there becomes a dominance within groups and a marginalization within groups. So for example, white women are transparent as women, and black men are transparent as black, yet black women are erased and fighting against erasure within both the group women and the group blacks. So the politics of interlocking oppressions serves many well, but it serves no one better than the pure, rational, full citizen. The logic of purity is used to exclude members of oppressed groups and to separate and disconnect oppressions. People who curdle separate are themselves people from whom others split separate, withdraw, dissociate. So multiplicitous beings, the disabled, the queer, the homosexual, trans persons, persons with culture, persons operating on a logic of purity tend to split separate from these kinds of people. Further, the logic of transparency works to split separate Mestizaje beings from other curdled beings. So we can become lovers of purity in carrying out the oppression of other curdled beings concerned with constructing an orderly world. Again, intragroup difference. White women have become lovers of purity within feminism. Seeing all women as the same is a function of the logics of purity. Despite the fact that feminists are fighting for reprieve fighting for liberation, they're simultaneously working under logics of purity that separate, seeing all women as the same, refusing to identify intergroup difference, making it difficult to see that oppressions are interlocking. From a logic of purity standpoint, curdled thoughts are nonsensical because rationality is the means of our communication. And if we adopt the logic of transparency, we can come to view others as fragmented beings, separating them into parts, seeing black women only as women, and creating them as composites, thereby marginalizing them. So we cannot consider as our own only those who reject the same dichotomies that we reject. It's the impulse to reject dichotomies and embody that rejection that allows us to live as complex, multiplicitous subjects, and to allow others to live as such, free from oppressive categorization. So the point here is that we could be aware of the dichotomies that affect us negatively, that oppress us, like gender dichotomies, right? Male, female, masculine, feminine. But if we're unaware of other kinds of dichotomies that oppress other beings who are multiplicitous and not pure, then we are participating in logics of purity. So we have to be willing to reject all dichotomies as such, to reject the logic of purity, to reject the categorization of people into rational, irrational, marked, unmarked, pure, impure, good, bad, right? And allow others to live free from oppressive categorizations. So curdling is not something that happens to us, but something we do. So curdling is a way of being, a multiplicitous way of being, Mestizaje. But it's something that we have to do. It doesn't happen to us. What happens to us is logics of purity, categorization. But the art of curdling is something that we have to perfect, that we have to work on. It's something that we do. It's a form of resistance to the logic of purity. It's a practice of resistance through which we create ourselves and each other.